This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of History Off the Page. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Hansen, and in today's episode, we'll be discussing the First Arab-Israeli War. Some of you might refer to this as the War of Israeli Independence. This is now the 11th episode in our special series on the history of Israel-Palestine. If you haven't heard any of our previous episodes, I'd really recommend going back and at least listening to a couple that we did about the Nakba. These episodes cover a variety of issues such as the 1947 UN Partition Resolution, the outbreak of civil war in November 1947, and then the destruction and collapse of Palestinian society that followed between March and May of 1948. The events that I've just described actually follow pretty seamlessly into today's topic. In fact, you could make a pretty reasonable argument that what we're talking about here today is really the fourth episode in this couple of episodes about the Nakba, not really a separate, distinct war. And this is because, again, the two are so fundamentally related to each other. I mean this not only chronologically, which is the case, right? If you listen to our previous episode on the Nakba, it basically ends around May 15th, 1948. Well, guess when the war starts, the Arab-Israeli War? It starts May 15th, 1948. But I also mean this conceptually. We spoke, again, at the end of our last episode about ethnic cleansing, about the tremendous violence that was visited upon Palestinian civilians and non-combatants. But again, as we mentioned, this violence doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It's directly related to Israeli expectations about the impending Arab invasions that we're going to talk about today. Or to put this more directly, I think a lot of Israeli military planners understood ethnic cleansing not as a kind of separate action on the side, something different, something that was a kind of moment of opportunity, but they understood it as being part of the military plan, a kind of military necessity that was vital to securing the existence of the Jewish state against its Arab neighbors. So again, if you haven't listened to those episodes, if it's been a while, please go back and listen to them. They will really help you understand a lot of what we're talking about, some of the context of what we're talking about today. Finally, a brief programming note. One of our listeners contacted me the other day using the new comment feature on Spotify and asked if there was a book list for this series on Israel-Palestine. I've been thinking about doing something like this for a while, and so I will accelerate my efforts and I will try to get something posted on this in the next week or two, so maybe between August 20th and August 25th, and I'll try to include a list of titles and a brief kind of description, and you'll be able to find that on my website, www.historyoffthepage.com. Once again, that's www.historyoffthepage.com. Okay. To add a little bit more context to the story, the events that we've been talking about, the Jewish rebellion, the UN partition, civil war, these events, as I said, they do not occur in a vacuum, but they take place within the broader context of Middle Eastern politics. And here, one of the most important post-war developments was the surge in Arab nationalism that followed the end of World War II. Now, Arab nationalism is not new in 1945. There's a long history of it. We talked a little bit about it in our first episode when we were talking about the situation between Arabs and the Ottoman Empire. But in 1945, there is this kind of swelling feeling in many Arab countries that the time had come to break free from European colonial domination. And so as people living in places like Egypt and Syria and Jordan, as they look at the events taking place in Palestine after 1945, and to some extent before, they understand it as a moment of neo-colonization. To create a Jewish state was not the answer to a long-running problem of Jewish victimhood, as Zionists primarily understood it. Instead, for many Arabs, it was a reenactment of the Crusades, an effort by Europeans to steal Arab land and to sort of install themselves and continue to project power onto the Middle East and its Arab peoples. And so after 1945, the countries of the Middle East, at least the Arab ones, vehemently opposed the idea of partition. There is one small exception to this, which is Jordan, and that has more to do with the leadership, and we'll get into that in the course of the episode. In the run-up to the partition vote in 1947, many of the leaders of these Arab states often predicted violence against Jews, including the minorities living in places like Iraq, Yemen, and Egypt, were the resolution to be successful. When the resolution did pass and civil war broke out in late 1947, these Arab states voted to support irregular Palestinian forces such as the Arab Liberation Army, also known as the Arab Salvation Army, and other forces. Basically, they do this through the Arab League, which was formed in 1944, but the essential kind of consensus in the Middle East, outside of Jordan, which again we're putting an asterisk on, was that the idea of establishing a separate Jewish state was a moment of neocolonization, and therefore it could not be allowed. As Palestinian forces begin to fail in April 1948, the leaders of the Arab states therefore began to plot direct intervention. Now, to many observers at the time, as all this is going on, the expectation was that the tiny Jewish state would be overwhelmed by its larger, more populous neighbors. In many ways, if you think about it, this was a pretty rational conclusion to come to. The neighboring Arab states, in terms of population, were much larger. Egypt alone counted for a population of over 20 million in 1948. Syria had about 3 million people, while Israel possessed just about 500,000 Jews. There were, at least at the time that the mandate was awarded in 1947, there were some 400,000 Arabs that were supposed to be a part of the Jewish state. We talked about how many of these Arabs were driven out, forced into exile, while a very small minority of the Druze actually switched over and joined the Jewish side. But basically, you're talking about large countries with larger populations versus a very small country with a very small population. While many of these Arab states had been under some form of European colonial domination, mostly British, but you also had the French in Lebanon and Syria, they had at least enjoyed some degree of independence since the 1920s. These Arab states possessed modern institutions. They possessed modern bureaucracies. They possessed modern armies, at least to a certain degree. Nominally, they could count collectively on over 165,000 troops. That was almost a third of the population, the Jewish population, if you will, of Israel. That's a lot. These armies were not only larger, but they were better equipped. One of the things that states have access to is modern weaponry. These are armies that had tanks, they had artillery, they had armored cars, they had airplanes. Jewish forces, by contrast, were technically not a state army yet. Now, we know underneath the surface they've been training as the Haganah. There's actually quite a bit of coordination going on. But technically, and in some senses operationally, they were still in a process of evolution as you get to 1948. The nascent IDF also lacked a lot of those heavy weapons. The first Israeli tanks are literally put together out of scrap metal that the British have left behind when they evacuate in May of 1948. Now, this will change, and it will change quite rapidly, but at least going into the conflict, again, May 15th, 1948, it doesn't seem like the Jewish state is going to be able to survive for very long. Beneath the surface, however, there were a number of advantages enjoyed by the Yishuv or the Jewish community that took observers somewhat by surprise. First of all, while the Arab armies were larger and better equipped, the reality was that they could only send so many troops to the Palestinian theater, right? You can't just take all the troops out of Egypt and send them all to Israel. You need them in other places. There's other borders to guard. Some of them carry out a police function as well. Most of these armies are also based upon colonial armies. And the job of a colonial army in a colonial Egypt, in a colonial Syria, etc., is not to prepare for war in Germany or, to be sent to South Africa or, wherever. The job of a colonial army is primarily to keep order on behalf of the colonial patron in that country itself. And so I guess to put this another way, the Egyptian army is not designed to go fight a war somewhere else. The Syrian army is not designed yet to really be able to project power outside of the boundaries of Syria. Very few of these forces had any real combat experience. If you think about it again, the Egyptian army doesn't really fight in World War II. The Syrian army doesn't really do a whole lot. You have some Arabs that volunteer for the British army, and you have some Arab forces that will fight alongside the British in Iraq in 1941. But for the most part, these are not battle-hardened units. These are not battle-tested. The ideas that they are using, the strategies that they're using, these are somewhat novel. By contrast, the forces of the Yishuv, the Haganah, had a lot of combat experience. Not only had they just fought during the Civil War, but some of them had military experience during World War II, fighting in Jewish-specific units. Some of them had experience, as we talked about in our episode on the Arab Revolt. Some of them had fought in the 1930s alongside the British in special night squads. They had a lot of operational knowledge. They had a lot of combat experience. In addition to that, there were several thousand international volunteers that came over, veterans from World War II. Some of them were Jewish, some of them weren't. But they believed in the idea of creating a Jewish state. They believed in, again, you think about the map. Here's all these Arab countries. They're going to attack this little tiny Jewish state. It's easy to think about Israel as being the victim in the conflict, especially in 1948. And so just as happened in Spain in 1936, you have thousands of volunteers with combat experience, with technical skills like airmen, artillerymen, tank commanders. Right? They come to Palestine to fight on behalf of the nascent Jewish state. A second issue that undercut the Arab war effort is that even though they in many ways, you could say, started the war, or at least they decided to intervene, they determined when they were going to intervene, they determined where they were going to intervene, even though they had kind of the initiative initially, they were very poorly prepared for the war. They had not done the sort of long-term logistical planning that major combat operations involve. We are recording this in August of 2024. We're about 2.5 years, unbelievably, after the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians. Those of you who listen to the podcast, I bring this up all the time. One of the things that the Russians made a huge mistake with was they only planned for a 3-day war. And that had devastating consequences on the war effort, and it allowed the Ukrainians a chance to kind of respond and arm and mobilize for a serious long-term conflict, which they're now in. The Arab forces in 1948 in some ways also have this problem. They do not have large stockpiles of shells and ammunition and things like that. They are not prepared for a long war. The Yishuv in some way was because they were already in the middle of a long war. A third factor was the arms embargo that was levied at first by Britain and the United States, and then after May 29th by the United Nations. So 2 weeks into the war, the United Nations declares a ceasefire, and it prohibits countries from giving arms or weapons to the combatants in the fighting. Now, for the Arab states, this presents a huge problem. Where has Egypt, where has Jordan, where have they gotten their munitions from? Where has Iraq gotten their munitions from? All those tanks and airplanes and things that we just talked about. The answer, of course, is from their colonial patrons in Britain. And so when Britain sort of turns the munitions spigot off, it takes a while to figure out, okay, what do we do? Where can we get weapons? How can we pay for these weapons? Right? So running up into the conflict, the Arab states had not sort of set aside or built stockpiles of munitions to continue the war. And then once the war begins, they're kind of turned off quickly by the British and by the United States and more generally by the UN. For the Yishuv, however, this was less of a problem. The Yishuv had clandestinely built up its military force going back all the way to the 1920s. It had worked on securing weapons, rifles. They had tried to secure more heavy munitions. They hadn't quite been so successful. But they were already adapted to the idea of saying, okay, legally we cannot pursue this channel, but how else can we get weapons? What are the countries? Who are the arms dealers? What are the ways that we're going to be able to smuggle things through international monitors? Now, one of the most important things that they do is they realize very early on that the Soviets are not going to honor or respect this bloc. The Soviets, just as Joseph Stalin, Soviets have their own goals, right? So if it looks like it's going to support a Soviet goal, the Soviets will go through with it. In 1948, the Yishuv manages to make a series of large arms purchases from Czechoslovakia, which is kind of gets the green light from the Soviet Union to do this. And these weapons begin arriving in March of 1948, and they make a huge difference. Imagine you get a shipment of 50 million bullets. Imagine you get a shipment of tens of thousands of rifles, thousands of machine guns. The nascent IDF, the nascent Israeli forces, are able to take those munitions, put them into the hands of the young recruits, and send them out to fight on the battlefield. By contrast, especially the longer the war goes on, the weaker and weaker the Arab militaries become. Just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, in August of 1948, the Arab Legion, which is the kind of main Jordanian force, was the most successful, most well-equipped, most sophisticated Arab fighting force in the war. By August of 1948, they have enough shells for 5 days of combat. 5. The question of logistics badly hurt the Arab armies, right? It's not just weapons too, right? You have to send food. You have to send uniforms. You have to send all kinds of things over roads that are going over deserts, over mountain passes, right? The Middle East is not known for being a kind of flat, fertile plain where it's easy to move things around. Or at least, there's some areas, some river valleys, but there's a lot of mountains. There's a lot of deserts. It's also worth noting that the Jewish community had access to the kind of global financial market of Jews around the world. Right? Jews around the world gave donations, sent hundreds of millions of dollars to help fund the war effort. The Arab states do not have this kind of financial power, and they are unable to raise the funds to be able to fight the war or to kind of circumvent the arms embargo and get more of those heavy weapons. Okay, all of these reasons are important. Many of them can be found in other conflicts as well. But the most important reason I would argue that Arabs are going to lose the first Arab-Israeli war is that the projection of Arab unity is just that. It is a projection. We talk about this as being the Arab-Israeli war, but that name is highly misleading. Because underneath the surface of the idea of Israel is on one side and all the Arab countries on the other, the Arab countries themselves were deeply divided in terms of what the aims of the war actually were. They all come out and say, we're going to save Palestine, we're going to destroy the Zionist, usurper, we're going to get rid of it. But this is all kind of political rhetoric. Strategically, they all had very different goals, and they sort of pursued these goals at the cost of helping the Palestinians or even really defeating the Israelis. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but again, the major culprit, the major example of this is going to be the Jordanians. One of the things that is kind of controversial, it's kind of denied by official Jordanian historiography, or at least was for many years, but there seems to be a lot of kind of evidence for it, especially in Israeli correspondence that comes out in the 1980s, is that King Abdullah and the Jordanian government essentially worked out a partition agreement with the Israeli state ahead of the war breaking out. One of the big questions, right? So we have the civil war. It takes place. Israel occupies portions of what was supposed to be part of Palestine. They exile people. They kick them out. There's ethnic cleansing. But they didn't occupy the West Bank. They didn't occupy all of the territory that was supposed to become Palestine. And so why is there no Palestine born in 1948? The answer is not only Israel, Jews, etc. The answer also has a lot to do with other Arab countries, and in particular, the Jordanians. Now, this question of the marginalization of the Palestinians by their would-be saviors is an important one. And so before we get into the course of the war, I just want to kind of flush this out a little bit because, again, it seems kind of weird to us if you're sitting here saying, okay, we're intervening, we're going to go fight in this conflict to protect these people, to save this country. Why don't we save the country? Why isn't there a real effort made to do that? And so we want to talk about that just very quickly. The Arab League in 1944, 1945, as it's coming into being, does have a representative for the Palestinian people. And as we mentioned, they do express continual support for the Palestinian cause. However, it is not a uniform body. Inside of the Arab League, there are deep divisions between Egypt and the Jordanians, who are basically more concerned with what would happen to the territory that was allotted to the Arabs than they were the idea of building an independent Palestinian state. In the immediate aftermath of the April offensives, for example, the Palestinian government that had sort of been cobbled together, that was coming into existence in, again, sort of spring 1948, that government essentially disintegrates. A lot of its leaders flee. Some take refuge in places like Egypt. Others go to New York. Others are in Switzerland, right? So the movement itself, the political leadership is dispersed. And obviously on the ground, a lot of Palestinian infrastructure is destroyed. You would think, as was the case in Poland, right? Poland gets destroyed as well, 1939. The Polish leaders flee to London. Some of them go to the Soviet Union, but they almost immediately begin working on creating a government in exile. In the Palestinian case, this only really begins to gain momentum in early September 1948. And this is less because all of a sudden the Egyptians thought, oh, well, now we really want a Palestinian government. Now we're ready to move into Palestine. They'd already occupied, as we'll see, some of the territory. But it had much more to do with dueling Egyptian and Jordanian efforts to control the Palestinian movement, to make the Palestinians essentially a proxy for the control, or as in the Jordanian case, the annexation of what was supposed to be Palestinian territory. At the start of September, for example, the Egyptians pushed the Arab League to approve the formation of a Palestinian government under the former Mufti Haj Amin. Now, this government was going to be based in Gaza, interestingly, not in the West Bank. But that was in part because at this point, Haj Amin had lost a lot of his political power. His chief rivals, the Nashashibi clan, they had gone over to the Jordanian side. They had kind of long supported an alliance with Abdullah of Jordan. And so the Egyptians begin kind of theoretically setting up this government under Haj Amin. But the Palestinian government in exile had no independent budget. It had no bureaucracy, it had no civil service, and it had no real army to enforce any of the decisions that it made. Now, this Palestinian government claimed control, or claimed sort of the sovereignty, if you will, over all of Palestine. It declared Jerusalem was its capital, even though it was based in Gaza. And yes, obviously it would have been difficult for it to project power inside of what became Israel, right? The Palestinian government in exile has little to say about what happens in Tel Aviv. But even in places that were controlled by friendly Arab armies, even in Gaza itself, it basically has to rely on the Egyptians. Now, I mentioned before the Jordanians, as this effort to build a kind of Palestinian government in exile comes together, their response is not to work with it, not to try to woo it, not to try to support it and kind of corrupt it may be too strong a word, but to try to win influence with it. Their response is to convene a separate all-Palestine government. Their response is to create their own version of Palestinian governments called the National Palestinian Conference, or National Palestine Conference. On October 1st, so just a couple weeks after the Egyptians are trying to put together this all-Palestine government after September 30th, which is a major date for the Egyptian version of it, they call on Abdullah to formally take the territory of the West Bank under his protection. 6 weeks later, Abdullah is actually crowned king of Jerusalem. And another conference of Palestinians in Jericho will declare him king of Palestine and call for unification of the West Bank with Jordan. Now remember, all this is going on as the First Arab-Israeli War is still taking place. And so even when someone like Hajj Amin tries to revive the Holy War Army, which had been one of the sort of irregular Palestinian militias fighting during the Civil War, the Jordanian king orders his forces to disband all armed bodies that are occupying in Jordanian territory that have not sworn allegiance to him. In other words, to kind of clean this up a little bit, you are supposedly intervening on behalf of the Palestinians. You are creating this kind of Palestinian government that is nominally supposed to speak for them. And at the same time, as the war is going on, you are disarming Palestinian troops because you do not want them to actually be fighting. You do not want them to actually be successful. This is what I'm talking about when I say that the Arab forces, even though, rhetorically they're all united, at the actual level of the war, of the actual conflict, there are strong divisions and there is a lot of working against Palestinian interests. To put this kind of a more bold way, the Palestinians after May 1948 were not only fighting against the Israelis, but they were in a way kind of fighting against their own frenemies, right? The other Arab states who were less interested in their own well-being and more interested in achieving their own political goals. All right, we're almost 30 minutes into today's episode, and I haven't really gotten into a lot of detail about the war itself, so perhaps this is a good point to switch gears and talk about the actual course of the war. Some of you out there, you really love the history of warfare. You know all the major battles and dates and the kind of course of World War I, World War II, but the first Arab-Israeli war might be a little bit of a mystery. So let's go ahead and provide some details about that. Basically, we can break the first Arab-Israeli war down into 3 distinct phases. And each of these phases was separated by a UN-mandated ceasefire agreement. The first of these phases begins on May 15th, 1948, when you have these invasions that are led by Egypt, Syria, Iraq. Put an asterisk on Jordan. They do participate, but not quite in the same way as the others. And then the Lebanese, as we'll talk about, also sort of play a role in the story as well. In this initial phase, we can say that in general, the Arab armies not only had this sort of initiative, they were the ones deciding when the battles would be fought, the course of the war, the strategy, etc., but they were also at their kind of high point in terms of their strength vis-a-vis Israel. In other words, the longer that the war went on, the stronger the Israeli side tended to get, especially after the first truce, the weaker the Arab armies became for some of the reasons we talked about. Now, as I mentioned, the initial phases of the war were not well planned out by the Arab side. There was a kind of talk about consensus, a talk about collaboration, of working together. But in the end, it wasn't something that was well planned out. It wasn't something that was well coordinated. And as we'll see in a moment, many of the combatants kind of did their own thing when it came to actually advancing boots on the ground. To the extent that there was a general plan, this was drafted by a Syrian captain named Wasfi Tal, who basically envisioned an 11-day limited campaign that was designed to secure certain parts of Palestine. And this is important, right? Because the rhetoric of the period, the way that people are talking is we are going to drive the Jews into the sea. We are going to destroy the Zionist entity, right? There is a very clear, at least in a rhetorical sense, a clear mission of not allowing the Jewish state to be born. But the military plans don't really envision that kind of conflict. They never really make an attempt to seize Tel Aviv. There are some thoughts, as we'll see in a second, about possibly advancing on Haifa. Jerusalem is kind of a mess. But the initial plans that the Arab armies come up with are much more limited in focus than the rhetoric that their political leaders are offering. At any rate, Tal's plan basically called for Syria and Lebanon to attack from the north, Iraqi and Jordanian units would attack from the east, moving especially to the northwest. And the idea here was to converge in a kind of pincher-like movement on the town of Afula. Afula is located in the strategically important and very fertile Jezreel Valley. In some ways, it linked different Jewish communities together, so it would have been able to sort of split up the nascent Israeli state. And then there was some talk of a possible sort of second movement once Afula was captured, as I said, to take Haifa. Now, as all this was going on, the Egyptians were supposed to move up the coast from Suez. And the idea was that the bulk of the fighting would occur in the north and would basically take place in areas of major Arab settlement. Right? So if you're thinking about this kind of difficult, especially like very intense personal fighting, the distinctions between civilians and militiamen, you've got a civil war going on, right? The idea is you want to avoid putting your troops in areas where they are surrounded by hostile forces, right? That makes logistics very difficult. That's going to result in house-to-house fighting. And so basically, again, they're not going to get too involved in Tel Aviv. They're not going to get too involved in Jerusalem. Now, whatever the merits of Tal's plan were, or the problems with it potentially, we never got to find out, because Tal's plan is kind of erased right in the beginning because of some changes that are implemented by the Arab states themselves. I mentioned just a second ago, everybody on the ground, even though they're talking of unity, even though they're talking of coordination, on the ground, a lot of them do the things that they think are in their best interest. The Lebanese, for example, instead of participating in the invasion, basically the night before it's supposed to start, they say, oh, actually, we're not going to be involved. We'll set up some defensive formations. We'll provide some support to some Palestinian organizations, but we're not actually going to carry out our part in the invasion that we were supposed to do. Now, why this was is not 100% clear. Those of you that are familiar with Lebanon might know that it has a very complicated sort of ethnic situation. You have a lot of Maronite Christians. You have Shiite Muslims who don't necessarily get along all the time with Sunni Muslims. And so there's a question about, were they maybe less enthusiastic about the idea of mobilizing against another religious minority, right? Knowing that they're also religious minorities. The most important change, though, is one that we've already kind of alluded to, which is the case of the Jordanians. The Jordanians were supposed to spearhead the attack from the east. They were supposed to kind of provide one of the major wings along with the Iraqis moving against that kind of northwestern area of Jewish settlement. But on the eve of the war, technically on the 13th of May, Abdullah directs his forces not to attack Israel, not to attack Jewish formations, but instead to move into and to secure the West Bank. In other words, to take the other part of what was supposed to be Palestine. It's about 22% of the original kind of mandate territory, so it's not insignificant. Abdullah directs his forces to go and take that over and occupy it. Right, we're going to defend Palestinians by kind of taking over their land and protecting them, right, so they're not being attacked. But we're not going to actively antagonize Israel. We actually don't want to fight with them at all, or at least the Jordanians didn't. The political leadership didn't. On the ground, some of the soldiers were very invested in the conflict, but they never, at least initially, got the chance. Now, there's a long kind of backstory to this, and a lot of it has to do with King Abdullah of Jordan, or what was then called Transjordan. Basically, if you recall, we talked about this in one of our earlier episodes. Abdullah comes to power in Transjordan basically as a consolation prize. His brother Faisal becomes the king of Iraq. The British are looking for kind of allies in the region, and so they make Abdullah the king of what is called Transjordan. Now, Transjordan at the time is not some great prize. The capital of Amman, when Abdullah arrives in 1921, has about 2,000 people in it. So just to give you an idea of the size and the importance of this state that he's taking over. But Abdullah is ambitious. Abdullah comes from a major family. His father was Sharif Hussein of Mecca, a very powerful and important person, leader of the Arab Revolt during 1916, 1917. And so Abdullah is thinking about, how can I grow my territory? How can I become more powerful? In the 1930s, as the British are trying to work out a solution for the mandate, one of the recommendations is this idea of partitioning Palestine into a sort of Israeli part, into an Arab part. And so one of the drafts of that commission report actually advocated the idea that we take the Arab section of Palestine and we unite it in union with Transjordan. And we put all of that under the rulership of Abdullah. Now, ultimately, of course, the Peel Plan was rejected, but the idea never really goes away. And so really for several decades, Abdullah is always kind of in contact with the Yishuv. Abdullah is throwing out feelers. He's kind of saying, well, what if the solution to the Palestine problem is I just take over everything? We unite the territory of Palestine with the territory of Jordan, and then I grant my new Jewish subjects some autonomy. I give them some land. I give them some special rights. He was willing to make perhaps some concessions that the Ottoman sultans were not before World War I in terms of setting up a kind of autonomous Jewish community. After World War II ends, Abdullah is not ready to move away from this dream of annexing all or part of Palestine. He has a series of secret meetings with members of the Yishuv starting in August of 1946, where they basically make an official agreement. Now, Abdullah does come out and he tries to pitch this idea of taking all of Palestine, and that's rejected. And then the two sides basically say, well, if you wanted to take the Arab or the Palestinian part of Palestine, then we're totally fine with that. So again, they reach this official agreement, secret agreement, in August of 1946. In November 1947, in the run-up to the actual partition resolution, the civil war is kind of on the horizon, Golda Meir will visit Abdullah and reconfirm this kind of handshake deal. Now, she'll meet with him again on May 10th, 1948, right, just days before the invasion. Her kind of take on it is that he sort of waffles, right? He's not going to come out and say that he's not going to participate in the invasion. But in the end, again, this is his initial decision, is not to fight against the Israelis, but rather to kind of take over Rump Palestine and incorporate it for his own purposes. By the way, in February 1948, Abdullah's representatives floated this idea to the British government. The British government never technically says, yeah, go ahead with it, but they don't say don't do it either. And so from kind of all parties involved, the idea was sort of like, wink, wink, we're okay with this, move forward with this annexation of what was left of Palestine. At any rate, to get back to our story of the course of the war, these last-minute shifts in strategy had important consequences for the other Arab forces. The Syrians no longer felt able to sort of come down from the north and march on Afula directly, so instead, again, the night before the invasion, they have to reposition their forces. The most important change to Tal's battle plan, however, was made by the Egyptians. Remember, the Egyptians were supposed to move kind of up the coast. They were supposed to put pressure on the Israelis from the south. But their leader, King Farouk, is also intensely jealous. He has a rivalry with Abdullah. And even though these agreements to annex the West Bank are secret, the partition agreements are secret, Farouk is not blind. Farouk realizes what's going on, and when the Jordanians say, oh, actually, we're not going to attack Israel in the northeast, we're actually just going to focus on occupying the West Bank, Farouk kind of smells a rat, and he says, we can't allow the Jordanians this massive land grab. Yes, we're fighting the Israelis, but we can't allow the Jordanians such a big victory without any fighting that they really increase their power and prestige. And so one of the things that the Egyptians do, never a good idea in war, unless maybe Robert E. Lee gets away with it a couple times, but usually a bad idea in war, the Egyptians divide their forces. They're going to send the main bulk of their forces northward. They're going to move up into the Gaza Strip, but they're also going to divert some forces into central and southern Israel. They will take not only the town of Beersheba, but they will move into the southern part of the West Bank even approaching the outskirts of Jerusalem. The idea here is that if Egyptian forces are in southern Israel, southern Palestine, the southern West Bank, then the Jordanians can't annex it. Now you can see here already what one of the fundamental problems in the war from the Arab side is going to be. Talked about this idea of disunity. When you are fighting an opponent, a difficult opponent, especially when it's several against one, you need to gang up on the one. You need to concentrate. You want to use the example of World War II. The United States and the Soviet Union have a rivalry. You can argue that the Cold War was on the horizon, that it wasn't that surprising that it would break out. There's definitely certain things that they do in the war to maximize their own advantage. But they don't suddenly say, okay, we're not going to do the D-Day invasion because we're worried about, the USSR. Right? They stay focused on Germany and then on Japan. And only after World War II do you really get the start of the Cold War. Now, military operations rarely proceed as planned, and this can also be seen in the opening stages of the Arab-Israeli War. In the beginning, the Jordanian Arab Legion, which is commanded by the British officer or former British officer John Glubb, they enter the Arab portion of Palestine on midnight, May 15th, 1948, and they encounter little resistance. There were basically no Jews in the West Bank at this time. And the Palestinians expect that the Jordanians are there to protect them. Right? This is right at weeks after Deir Yassin. There's a lot of rumor about what could happen. They're not, oblivious to the violence and the ethnic cleansing that's gone on. And so the Jordanians are basically greeted initially as liberators. The problem for the Jordanians comes with the Israelis, right? They're kind of paying lip service to this idea that they're going to fight, but they don't really want to fight, and they kind of have an agreement not to fight. But the situation in Jerusalem becomes dire, it becomes pressing, and it will basically suck the Jordanians into this first stage of the war, whether they wanted to or not. Now, Jerusalem, you might recall, was not initially supposed to be part of the Israeli or the Palestinian state, but it was supposed to be an international area. They were going to kind of set up a UN government and then do some other things. But what ends up happening is that as you have these kind of sporadic acts of violence, basically the people living in the city self-segregate. Now, put an asterisk on self-segregate. It doesn't mean everybody's leaving willingly. There's plenty of trying to intimidate people, trying to push, minorities out of the ethnic neighborhoods that they're in. But basically, the city of Jerusalem becomes divided between its Jewish and its Arab inhabitants. As this kind of civil war is taking place, the British are still there, but they play a less and less active role in terms of trying to separate the two sides. And by February, the city's Jewish population, which at this point is tending to concentrate on the western side of the city, that group of 100,000 Jewish civilians, they are cut off from water supplies, the ability to restore them. You have to kind of take a road from Tel Aviv into Jerusalem. And as we talked about in our episodes on the Nakba, basically the villages alongside that road are Arab. And so one of the things that happens is Arabs will use those villages to shoot at the convoys. And as you get further and further into March, it becomes increasingly difficult for Israeli forces to supply the Jewish areas of Jerusalem. This is one of the reasons that the ethnic cleansing happens, right? It starts with this idea of we can't allow these people to live here because they're threatening our supply lines. And so, as we said, the Israeli forces will take over these villages. They will expel all the Arabs that are living there. And this is kind of on the run up to the Nakba. It's the first kind of stages of the Nakba. At any rate, as I said, the people living in Jerusalem are aware of all of these things going on. They're aware of the violence. And as the British begin to fully withdraw at the middle part of May 1948, there is a kind of race to take over the positions that they occupied. Now, in some cases, the British will kind of give forewarning to one side. They'll let the Arabs know. They'll let the Jewish forces know, hey, we're going to leave this police station. And those local Jewish forces and local Arab forces will kind of rush to take these things over. As the British are leaving right around the time that this war starts, again, the middle of May 1948, Jewish forces will capture a number of these strategic places. This, in turn, will trigger panic among some of the Arab population of Jerusalem. In the middle of a civil war, it's hard to tell what does it mean if one side captures another position. Right? A lot of this is predicated on the idea of security. I want to control the roads. I want to control the water sources because I want to make sure that I have access to them. But if I do that and you're on the other side of things, it's really hard for you to figure out, oh, okay, they're taking this over because they have anxiety, but they're still going to let us use that water source, right? But we don't know that. We can't necessarily trust that. And so the fighting will intensify in the city of Jerusalem. Arabs that are living on the outskirts of Jerusalem, again, knowing this kind of lesson from Deir Yassin, they will flood into the city of Jerusalem. And not only do they go in there and then say, okay, we'll just hunker down, but as they see Jewish forces taking over some of these places, some of these intersections, police stations, telegraph offices, whatever, they feel as if they are about to be destroyed. And so they call on their Arab brethren. They literally send out an SOS. Come save us. Well, who is the closest Arab army to Jerusalem at this point? It is the Jordanians. And so it's very hard for Abdullah to sit back and say, I'm not going to be involved. I'm not going to come save you. And yet I'm also part of this coalition. And yeah, I'm really trying to save Palestinians. And so Abdullah will, on May 18th, order his army to occupy parts of the city of Jerusalem. In the ensuing fighting, the Arab legionaries, which are, again, some of the strongest forces involved in this war, they manage not only to secure those Arab areas, but they will also conquer the Jewish quarter of the Old City. They will expel the Jewish population of the Old City. They, and probably some locals, will burn local synagogues. They will burn Torahs. Obviously, again, in the broader context of things, right, you have the Israeli forces are using violence against civilians. There are, as I said, examples of Arab forces using violence against Jewish civilians, right? It's a civil war. It's ugly. It's awful. And it's a part of the history that we need to recognize. Once the Arab legionaries have conquered, especially the eastern part of Jerusalem, which also happens to include the Temple Mount, which also happens to include the Dome of the Rock and the Wailing Wall. Once they take these areas, Israeli forces will make it a point of focus to try to reconquer, not necessarily Jerusalem itself, but to reestablish communication and supply links with that western edge of the city. In particular, they made 3 separate assaults on the strategic hilltop of Latrun, outside of Jerusalem, but they failed in each of these efforts. Again, it's very easy when we look at the bigger, broader history of this conflict to kind of marvel at how quickly the IDF became the big bad bulldog, how quickly they became superior in many different ways to the Arab armies. But it's also worth noting that they experienced several failures as well, in particular fighting against the Jordanians in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem. In the end, what they end up doing, in addition to kind of, again, clearing out those Palestinian villages, is they build a separate road to the western side of Jerusalem. They call this the Burma Road. It's modeled on a very famous road from World War II. And that road will be completed on June 10th, one day before the start of the first UN-imposed truce. At this point, we can sum up Abdullah's thinking on the war and the kind of broader Jordanian thought on the war as being content, as being successful. We entered the war, we saved the West Bank and its Arab population, and we even managed to take over the Dome of the Rock, which is the 3rd holiest site in all of Islam. Which, by the way, if you're Abdullah, again, Your dad was the guy who was charged with the defense of Mecca, was the Sharif of Mecca. He was later deposed. So you come from a glorious, illustrious family. You get put in this, what many commentators would have described as kind of backwater of Transjordan. No one wants it. And all of a sudden, in the middle of this war, you are now the ruler of the third holiest site in all of Islam, the Dome of the Rock. And so basically, two things follow from this. One, for Abdullah, he's ready to end the war. Sign the peace treaty. Let's have permanent peace. Let's not fight ever again. We've done what we wanted to do as Jordanians. We're ready to go home. And so in terms of coordination with other allies, we've already talked about some of the hostility with Egypt. There are tensions with Syria, with other Arab countries as well. The Jordanians don't really want to be part of the coalition anymore. They're ready to go home. And that will complicate the ability of the Egyptian and the Syrian armies to fight. The other consequence is one that we often forget. And this is that the city of Jerusalem, basically for about 20 years, was a divided city. It was analogous in many ways to Berlin during the Cold War, or at least after 1961. There was literally a demilitarized zone. There was only one checkpoint that you could cross from one side to the other. Jews, incidentally, were not able to worship at the Western Wall during this period. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about the Jordanians here. Let me cover really quickly some of the other theaters. We mentioned that one of the main parts of the plan was the Egyptians coming up from the south, and then that they decided to kind of split their columns into two directions. Basically, over the first week of fighting, the Egyptians were largely successful. They managed to occupy Beersheba. They made it all the way to Bethlehem. And as I mentioned, they reached the outskirts of Jerusalem itself. So that plan of trying to kind of break up what Abdullah was trying to achieve, they came very close to actually pulling that off, at least in the initial phase. The main Egyptian force moved up the coast. They successfully entered Gaza, which then, as now, was overwhelmingly Arab in terms of population. They begin to move northwards on the coastal plain towards Tel Aviv. But here they encountered some isolated kibbutzim, and their attack kind of broke down, in part because of the resistance of the kibbutzim, but also because of these issues of logistics. You can go and read, actually, some of the comments by General Nasser, who we'll talk about at the very end of the podcast. He was actually a soldier in the expeditionary force, and he was very, very critical of the Egyptian military's planning of the war. Towards the end of May, Israeli forces will hit the Egyptians with a counterattack, especially that northern part of the Pincher. The Egyptian attack will bog down, kind of in the northern Negev. And the battle lines will essentially freeze until, again, the truce came into effect on June 11th. Now, whereas the Jordanians were very content with how the war had gone to this point, the Egyptians found themselves in a very difficult position. Their supply lines were overstretched. Their troops were spread out across all of sort of southern Israel or southern Palestine. And their ability to launch new attacks would be severely hampered. Doesn't mean they won't try, right? They were probably, out of all the people involved in the fighting, they were one of the most committed forces to the idea of destroying the issue of destroying a kind of Zionist state. But their ability to carry out these attacks was very limited. Okay, last front to touch on is the northeastern corner of Israel-Palestine. This is the area around the Sea of Galilee. And this was more complicated because you had several Arab countries that were supposed to be participating in it. We mentioned the Syrians a moment ago. Their main objectives, as we talked about, were shifted on the eve of the invasion. They do invade on the 15th. They move in against a number of kibbutzim near the southern tip of the Sea of Galilee. And for the first 5 days, they experience general successes in terms of advancing. They run into some stout defenses near the village of Deganias. And once Israel begins to train some of its limited artillery on their headquarters at Samak, they basically kind of lose their nerve and they will withdraw. Now, they would have one brief incursion near Lake Hula on June 5th, but this seems to be more of an attempt to kind of make a statement that we participated in the war, we had some success in the war. But basically, they don't have a strong role to play in the war. We mentioned the Lebanese. The Lebanese say, okay, we're actually not going to fight. We're going to just equip some of the Palestinian forces, and especially they're not Palestinian, but they're pro-Palestinian. They're mostly Syrians. It's a volunteer army led by a guy named Fawzi al-Kawukchi, who we've talked a lot about in the course of the podcast. This was the Arab Liberation Army. So the Lebanese are kind of saying, well, we'll play an auxiliary role. And then they too will kind of jump in and try to take a village towards the end of the fighting. The last major combatant that we should mention are the Iraqis. The Iraqis ended up playing kind of the major role again in this northeastern area or theater of the invasion. The Iraqis, like the Egyptians, were very, very motivated. The Iraqis, perhaps I said the Egyptians maybe were, but maybe the Iraqis were even more motivated than the Egyptians. They managed to send about 4,500 soldiers, along with armored cars. They had some field artillery, and all of this moved to the front in late April. So even as these questions are being asked about what should we do, where should we perhaps invade, the Iraqis were very eager, very enthusiastic to participate. On the morning of May 15th, they crossed the Jordan River, and they occupied several points along the oil pipeline that stretched from Mosul to Haifa. They managed to have a number of limited successes, but then again, their attack also broke down near the kibbutz of Gesher. Just a week into the fighting, they were withdrawn and moved instead to Samaria. Samaria is kind of on the northern edge of the West Bank, and their job was to basically protect the Jordanian flank. So even though the Iraqis were very, very enthusiastic about fighting in the war, they basically get withdrawn and tied into the Jordanian effort, which is no longer about the offensive after the capture of East Jerusalem, but it is purely defensive. The Iraqi forces, like the Syrian forces, do not seem to respond well to combat. Again, this is their first kind of foray into a major war in quite some time. They do have some moments where they are somewhat successful. One of the most important Iraqi military contributions to the war was the defense of the Arab city of Jenin. The Israelis do manage to briefly take the town, but the Iraqis kind of push them out and defend it really well. But on the whole, what we're seeing here with the Arab forces is that they kind of ran out of gas fairly quickly. Maybe the Jordanians were the lone exception to this, but the Jordanians never really wanted to be fully engaged in the fighting itself. And so a week to 2 weeks into the war, all of a sudden this initiative has passed from the invading Arab forces to the counterattacking Israeli forces. And so when the United Nations imposes its 28-day truce, the vote for this on May 29th, 1948, it ends up coming into effect, as I said, on June 11th. The effect of this is going to be a major, major boost to the Israeli side. Had things ended then, had the truce actually been a peace treaty, one could characterize it as a limited Israeli victory. Despite facing multiple, better armed opponents, despite kind of emerging from the civil war, of having been in war for almost a year, the new Israeli state and its young defense forces had survived the initial Arab onslaught. In the north, Syrian, Lebanese, and Iraqi forces had basically been repulsed. They occupied very little territory. To the east, Jordanian and Iraqi forces had occupied the West Bank, but this wasn't really a great loss. Indeed, Israel had kind of already agreed to give that up in the idea of a partition. So the biggest kind of downside to the initial phase of the war for Israelis was A, the loss of the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem, and B, the Egyptian advances into the Negev and into southern Israel. All in all, however, Israel had survived, and it would now use the next 4 weeks to increase its arms, to expand its army. And so when the truce expired, the second phase would begin, which was much more of Israeli victories, Israeli initiative, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Of course, for the Arab forces, as I've kind of mentioned, the results were a little disappointing. They had some successes, but overall they had failed to destroy the Jewish state. And again, set aside the goals of an Abdullah, the rivalries with the King Farouk, for the ordinary Egyptian, Syrian, Iraqi soldier, for the volunteer who said, I'm going to stand up for my Palestinian Arab brothers in Palestine. I will never allow the creation of a Jewish state. They weren't able to prevent that. They had failed to destroy it. And in addition, because they had crossed into Israeli territory, because the war was being fought largely in Israel, or Palestine, if you will, the global opinion tended to side with the Israelis. For the most part, hampered by the arms embargo and divided in terms of their strategic objectives, Arab forces would essentially be on the defensive for the rest of the war. Of course, the real losers in all of this were the Palestinians, who not only were not saved, but whose chances at an independent state were snuffed out not by the Jews, not by the Israelis, although obviously they played a role in it, especially in the beginning, but in the end, it's their own fellow Arabs that betray them, and especially the Jordanians, who kind of destroy the idea of an independent Palestine for their own political gain. The Jordanians' seizure of the West Bank, the Egyptians' occupation of Gaza, left Palestinians in an odd position where basically they didn't have a clear political direction other than, obviously, they were hostile to Zionism. They wanted to see a Palestine restored. But it's one thing to have these desires. You need institutions. You need even something like a government in exile that can push this through. One of the deeper kind of issues in this longer history of the Middle East is the powerlessness of the Palestinian people, their inability to kind of control or even affect developments that happen. And starting in 1948, one could argue to some extent 1947, and going all the way through at least until the 1960s, their kind of understanding of how do we get back to having a country again relied on these Arab allies who were, again, I use the word frenemies. They express rhetorically support for Palestine, but they're also not really doing this for the benefit of the Palestinian people. And so it puts Palestinians in this very difficult, very powerless position for about 20 years, right? Again, they have no ability to control the events that are going on in their name. Okay, the truce that came into effect on June 11th was not only the product of a UN vote, but also came about as a result of the tireless efforts of the Swedish Count Folke Bernadotte, who was relentless in these efforts to secure a ceasefire. Bernadotte was an experienced negotiator, and he had successfully secured the release of several hundred Danish Jews and several thousand other prisoners from the Nazi concentration camp of Theresienstadt at the very, very end of World War II. He was appointed the UN mediator for Palestine just days after the war broke out. And again, he worked diligently to find a permanent solution to the unsolvable crisis. Not only did Bernadotte try to figure out, okay, how do we get them to stop shooting at each other? But once they agreed to the ceasefire, Bernadotte tried to come up with a plan that would make everybody happy. His first kind of suggestion as to what this could look like was the idea of a union between Israel and Jordan, right? Going back in some ways to that idea of the Peel Commission. The idea was that, yes, you would create a single state, but within this state, Jews would have a lot of autonomy, would have a lot of control over their local politics. There would be a lot of division. Now, as part of this agreement, the Negev Desert and the city of Jerusalem were to be handed over to the Jordanians. And Jews would be compensated for this by receiving areas of Western Galilee. Western Galilee had a number of Jewish settlements in it, but was outside the original 1948 partition resolution. Now, when Bernadotte made this initial proposal, the fighting was still very early on. Even if at the military level, a number of Arab commanders realized that the war had been lost, politically speaking, there was still a lot of hope that, okay, we had this first round. Everybody kind of, knows where we are now. We had experience now. When the second round starts, this time we'll accomplish what we failed to do the first time around. And so again, as we go into this period of about a month of the first truce, both sides don't really focus very much on the peace side of things. They focus on renewing efforts for war, resupplying. The IDF, for example, will almost double the number of soldiers that it commands. It will bring in about 4,000 troops from abroad, volunteers with experience from World War II. They will continue to receive clandestine arms supplies. This includes the purchase of more than 50 million bullets from Czechoslovakia. They pick up some Messerschmitt fighters, some B-17 bombers. As all this is going on, the French are kind of, wink, wink. We don't know what's in those crates and things like that you're bringing in. We're not aware that this is heavy artillery or a tank. And so the capability of the IDF is substantially enhanced over the summer of 1948. Now, the Arab expeditionary forces will also grow in size. The Arab forces also realize we need to commit more men, we need to commit more resources. But the problem is, in many ways, the arms embargo, right? They don't have the money, they don't have the ability to kind of sneak around the British and the United States and the UN, and so they're not able to match the incredible growth of the Israeli military. On July 8th, 1948, one day before the end of the truce, Egyptian forces will renew their offensive in southern Israel. It doesn't last very long, in part because the Israelis were also planning their own offensives, right? As soon as the truce is over, we're on the go. The Israelis, in fact, would launch a series of offensives, pre-planned on all three of the fronts, the idea being drive out the Arabs before a final peace treaty is signed. We mentioned those Egyptians. Just a week into the renewed fighting, they start running out of ammunition. The Israelis, on the one side, they just got 50 million bullets. They're ready to go. They can fight all day. They can go for weeks, for months. The Egyptians, a week into it, we're almost out of bullets. By early August, the Jordanians were down to about 5 days' worth of shells. You can't risk running out of artillery shells if you're a military commander. Right? The consequences can be devastating. Now, in the north, Israeli forces experience considerable success. One of the successes they have is not just because of superiority on the battlefield, but they had been making secret negotiations with a minority Arab sect known as the Druze. Druze, as I mentioned, they are a minority. They are very conscious of the fact that, well, okay, if the Jews are not the ones that are going to be attacked anymore, then we might be. We could be next. We could be discriminated against. And so they actually kind of stage like a little battle against the Israelis. And then once the battle is over, they go over to the Israeli side. And I use that word stage very intentionally, right? It's all a production. It's all designed to create the illusion of resistance. And then they declare for the Israeli side. In Israel today, you will hear people talk about the state of Israel. People that are critical of it will say, oh, it's an apartheid state. Arabs are discriminated against. And in the West Bank, that's certainly absolutely true. In Israel proper, not quite as much. Defenders of Israel will point to the Druze and will say, look, we've had people from this Arab community that have become generals, that have become Supreme Court justices. And this is true, right? If we're talking about, the situation in Israel itself, again today, the Druze become incorporated, the Bedouin as well, and they have done very well in the Israeli state. Obviously, I'm getting ahead of myself here talking about the present day. Another group that the Israelis work out an agreement with are the Christian Arabs of the town of Nazareth. Nobody really wants a lot of heavy fighting in Nazareth, obviously, the importance of the town to Christians. And so the town actually falls without really any fighting on July 16th. Most of Western Galilee is occupied by Israeli forces during this period, and when they occupy it, they will drive out the local Muslim and Arab populations. In the eastern part of Israel, we talked about the front around Jerusalem. The Jordanian forces basically try to do everything they can to hold East Jerusalem. They are on the receiving end of a number of IDF offensives. For the most part, they actually are able to hold out against those offensives, but they managed to lose two important towns, the towns of Lida and Ramlah on the outskirts of Jerusalem. And here, once again, Israeli forces will use the same logic that we saw during the Nakba. The idea being that we cannot have an Arab minority inside of Israel who will be hostile to us, so we better kick them out now while we have the chance. This ended the second phase of the fighting, which, again, as I said, is mostly full of Israeli military victories. They were able to push the Egyptians back in the south as well, although not entirely out of the Negev and out of southern Israel. And so, once again, we have a truce. This time it will come into effect on July 18th, 1948. Once again, American and British negotiators working with Folke Bernadotte will try to create some kind of plan to solve the unsolvable crisis, the unsolvable problem. Bernadotte will fly to Israel in September 1948 to present his second peace plan, which this time featured a partition of the land between Israel and the existing Arab states. Israel was supposed to surrender a significant amount of territory. It would basically be independent, but would locate itself along the coastal plain and Galilee. Jordan would receive the West Bank, much of the Negev, and Jerusalem would once again become an international city, and you would have little cantons within the city, and those cantons would either be Jewish or be Arab. Lida and Haifa were to become free ports, and Palestinian refugees would be given the right to return to Israel, or they could receive financial compensation if they understandably did not want to go back and become a minority in the new Israeli state. Now, whatever the merits of this plan were, there were a couple major problems. One of which you probably already guessed, other than giving Palestinians the right to return, suddenly the idea of an independent Palestinian Arab state was erased from the map. And again, this goes back to that issue that I've mentioned several times now of one of the problems in the current conflict is that Palestinians very rarely have an ability to control their own destiny. They get erased, not just in the sense of physically erased, but sort of psychologically. It's like their fellow Arabs, the United States, the British, the Israelis, like they don't see them and recognize them as being a separate people and as being a people that are worthy of having a place in these negotiations. Right? So people are negotiating on their behalf, but it's not them themselves that are doing it. The way that the disappearance of Palestine gets naturalized within these peace plans, I want to use the word frustrating, but that doesn't really even do it justice. Right? It must be enraging to feel that you just get erased as a people. A second problem with Bernadotte's plan is that it also rested on the proposition that both sides really just wanted peace, that both sides or all the sides involved, that they were all willing to make some kind of concessions, that negotiations were done in good faith. And I have to say, it's a bad misreading of the situation. In particular, I don't think Bernadotte really understood or appreciated the strength of the Israeli position, which again is understandable, right? The IDF, in terms of its military capability, became incredibly more powerful just in this 4-week period. But Bernadotte seemed to believe that the young Jewish state would accept turning back the clock in exchange for a right to exist. But by the summer of 1948, that right had already been secured on the battlefield. There was no urgency to make concessions, to give up the Negev, to give up, yes, to the West Bank to some extent. But there is no urgency to say, okay, we're going to relinquish Jerusalem or that portion of Jerusalem that has the Jewish inhabitants in the western side of the city. At the same time, Bernadotte's plan also badly underestimated the Arab states' hostility to Zionism. Which, yes, part of it was political in nature. But as we said, there were also kind of religious and especially cultural currents that were kind of feeding this opposition. The idea of creating a Jewish state is not just to many Arabs at the time, oh, okay, well, these people are just going to get this land and there'll just be a state here. It's not a purely political issue. As I said, it reawakens memories of the Crusades. It ties directly into the idea of European colonization and imperialism. This idea that, well, we can just accept something that's humiliating to us, something that's belittling us. The idea that Arab leaders could have accepted that. That King Farouk could have just said, we'll just accept it. Right? Even if he wanted to do that, even Abdullah, who kind of seems like he did want to do that, he couldn't just come out and say it. But you have to respect the will of your population, and the opposition of that population to the establishment of a Jewish state did not only come again from this idea of pure political rationality. I'm not trying to delegitimize it, right? I'm just saying this is how people felt. They didn't just feel this way because of the kind of cold, rational calculus of what if there is another state in the region. Right? It's not just another state. In retrospect, Bernadotte's plan strikes me as naive and idealistic. To some of the more radical Jewish groups in Israel in 1948, however, it seemed like an anti-Jewish plot. And so when Bernadotte arrives in Israel in mid-September 1948, he is assassinated by members of the Lehi in West Jerusalem. The shocking nature of this assassination will lead to the disbandment of the Lehi. But when we say disbandment, they don't really go away, they just get incorporated into the IDF. The peace process, however, suffers for all the criticisms I just made of Bernadotte. At least he was trying. At least he was aware. At least he was fighting for the idea of the repatriation of refugees. After his death in September 1948, his efforts would be undertaken by his deputy, Ralph Bunche, an American. But it's hard not to feel like some movement towards the peace process was still lost with this. Okay, the third phase of the war begins on October 15, 1948. This begins with the commencement of Operation Yoav, which was designed to kind of expel the Egyptians from the Negev. It basically is successful in that. There's a little area of a town called Fallujah. It's not the Fallujah in Iraq. It's different Fallujah. But the Egyptian forces basically get surrounded there, or a large number of them do. They're cut off. There's a couple additional Israeli operations that they will undertake. In particular, there'll be these kind of like mini ceasefires. In late December 1948, there will be a number of limited efforts also, again, to expel the Egyptians from what's left of Israeli territory, and these will largely be successful. There's also a couple attempts on the Israeli side to use force to kind of leverage the Egyptians and other Arab armies to get them to the peace table, because if you don't, more bad consequences are coming for you. To wrap all this up, as I mentioned, Bunche does finally get the various parties to the negotiating table. The first agreements come with the Egyptians, who seem to be the most important players in the fighting at this point. They agree to an armistice line in February 1949, and this gives them possession of the Gaza Strip. As would be the case with Korea and Vietnam, they establish a demilitarized zone, and the UN will set up a mixed armistice commission, which features representatives from both sides and a UN observer, and they will basically adjudicate violations of this DMZ. And not to get too far ahead of myself, but there are going to be a lot of violations of this DMZ, right? This is one of the broader kind of consistencies of at least the history of the Israeli-Palestinian and Israeli-Arab conflicts, is that they have times of peace and times of war, but even in the times of peace, there's always someone shooting a rocket, someone firing a sniper round off. These types of things go on all the time, which is also the case in places like Vietnam and Korea as well for many years. Eventually, additional agreements would follow in March with Lebanon, with Jordan in April, and with Syria in July. Not bordering Israel directly, the Iraqis refused to negotiate, and so there was actually a continuing state of war between the two nations after 1949. Iraq notwithstanding, the series of armistices signed in Rhodes in 1949 essentially ended the First Arab-Israeli War. But they did not resolve the fundamental issues that drove the conflict. The first of these issues was the refusal of Israel to allow the return of Palestinian refugees. I'll talk about this more in just a second. The second was the simultaneous refusal of the Arab states to recognize Israel's rights to exist. In essence, while the agreements temporarily froze the Israeli-Arab conflict, they did not resolve it. Instead, they should probably be thought of as a longer version of the previous two truces that had already failed. And as the region moved into the 1950s, these tensions remained, with violence, again, raids, sniper shots. These are experienced by both sides in the conflict. All that was required to restart hostilities was a spark, and that spark would be provided by the rise of Gamal Abdel Nasser and the decolonization of the Suez Canal. Beneath these geopolitical observations, however, the war had two much deeper, more fundamental legacies. And the first of these relates to the question of Palestinian refugees. As we mentioned, because of the war, there was no Palestinian state, right? And that obviously was a big deal. But even more importantly, demographically, think about what it meant for the uprooting of just under 1 million Palestinian Arabs. Ordinary men, women, and children who in many cases fled their homes or who were forcibly expelled by Israeli forces over the course of the war. Now, some of them may have left voluntarily. Some of them obviously were combatants. I would argue that a huge majority were not. And actually, if you look again at the evidence of the war, one of the really fascinating and surprising things is how many Palestinian Arabs did not want to fight, just wanted to have kind of non-aggression pacts with their local Jewish neighbors. Regardless of how they got there, the question is, what would happen to these almost 1 million refugees? And if you're wondering why the number goes up to 1 million, this is because as the fighting continues, you have more and more people that are driven into refugee status. As the war wound down in the summer of 1948, Israeli leaders were adamant that the refugees would not be allowed to return so long as hostilities continued. And they took active measures to prevent this. By active measures, I mean that they would shoot at civilians trying to return to a village that had been depopulated. They blew up homes and leveled buildings and actually put mines in some of the buildings to try to keep refugees from coming back. Now, not all Israelis agree that this approach was justified. Visiting Haifa in May 1948, shortly after the expulsion of the city's Arab community, Golda Meir noted the similarities between the experiences of the Arabs in Haifa and of Jews during the Holocaust. Was it not better to allow those who wanted to return to do so? The idea of allowing refugees to return also proved to be popular with members of the Israeli Labor Party, known as Mapam. It is one of those great counterfactual questions. What if the refugees had been allowed to return? What if they had been incorporated into Israeli society and given some kind of minority status, the right to practice their own religion, etc.? Would they have accepted the Israeli state? Would political leaders have emerged that said, okay, the war is over. As long as we can just keep living here, we will accept Israel, we will become Israeli citizens. Could they have finally built a multi-ethnic state, even if it was obviously a Jewish state, the existence was predicated on Judaism? Could they have healed the wounds then by allowing these refugees to return? Unfortunately, the experience of war and the fear of a fifth column quickly outweighed the moral dimensions of this question for many Israelis. As one local official put it, it was, quote, better to cause them injustice than to suffer a disaster, end quote. It's pretty clear, if it wasn't before, obviously Ben-Gurion had authorized all of these ethnic cleansing operations during the war, but it's pretty clear that he also decided never to allow these people to come back. When you get to the period of the Second Truce in the summer and fall of 1948, Israeli officials would carry out new cleansing operations on a very limited basis, but they were still carrying them out in newly occupied territories. At about the same time, the Agricultural Ministry and the Jewish National Fund began leasing abandoned fields to new Jewish settlements. In fact, over the course of the First Arab-Israeli War, about 180 new Jewish settlements were founded during the course of the war, and almost exclusively on top of existing or previously occupied Arab villages. Now, part of the reason for doing this can be linked, obviously, to the idea of ideology and to Zionism itself. And I mean this in the sense that when you're talking about Zionism, like many 19th century nationalist movements, the movement kind of expected there to be a close tie between the land and the people. And I mean that in a direct physical sense. If we want to become a strong people, if we want to become a healthy people, we need to focus on agriculture. We need to reclaim land. We need to grow food. We need to, do a hard day's work. And so this idea of a kind of conquest of the land is ideologically a part of Zionism. And in this particular sense, I wouldn't say universally the idea of taking it from other people, but in this particular sense, the idea that building the state of Israel required kind of farming these new lands, these newly available lands, there is an ideological component to that. But again, context matters. And there is a kind of ghastly arithmetic that in some ways it doesn't justify to us today, but it helps us understand why people living in Israel thought that this was a necessary thing to do. And this is partly because of something we talked about in our episodes on the Nakba. The Nakba is not just the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. You could argue it is the ethnic cleansing of the entire Middle East. Between May of 1948 and December of 1951, with a couple of notable exceptions, almost all of the Jewish communities in the rest of the Middle East are destroyed, and their people will flee. And where is the one place that Jewish refugees can now flee to? It is Israel. Not every single one of them goes to Israel, but the whole idea of creating a Jewish homeland was that if we had a repeat of 1939, the Jews would have a place to go to. And this is essentially what happens. It is a kind of asymmetrical population transfer. Palestinians, about 1 million of them, are kicked out. 700,000 Jewish refugees will come from all areas of North Africa and the Middle East, and they will be resettled in Israel. So, of course, when you're talking about resettling hundreds of thousands of people, this is more than the initial population that was supposed to exist in the Jewish state. Where are all these people going to live? It's not hard to kind of draw a line from A to B and say, well, we'll put them in the areas that the Arabs just left or were forced out of. Again, I'm not trying to defend this practice. I'm just saying that you can understand why people in this situation understood this as a form of justice. One more time, I'm not saying it's justice. I'm saying that's probably how they understood it. In the end, the vast majority of these refugees would be settled on farms and kibbutzim that will be built upon the ruins of Arab villages. One could argue that by the mid-1950s, in many ways, the Palestine of the 1930s no longer existed. Even if you had given these refugees the right to return, what they would have returned to was already so fundamentally different from what had existed before. However, this quote-unquote solution also created its own problem, and this was a problem that Arab states would have to deal with, which was, again, what would you do with these 1 million or just under 1 million Palestinians, and what would happen to them, and how would they experience this for generations? The condition that these refugees meet when they get to other countries, not exclusively Arab countries, but many of them do obviously end up in Arab countries, neighboring countries, Egypt, Jordan, Syria. The conditions that they meet are awful. As you can imagine, as the first waves get there, they try to find kind of public places to put them up in, tent cities, abandoned British military bases, things like that. But with the exception of the Jordanians, these refugees are not integrated into the host societies. The Palestinians living in Gaza don't get Egyptian passports, but they're not treated as Egyptians. They're not treated as Syrians or Lebanese. Now, the one exception to this is Jordan, in part because Jordan had kind of made its claim to the West Bank in the sense that it was defending Arabs, that it was protecting Arabs. So obviously it follows then that those Palestinians would become Jordanian citizens. Some Palestinians become refugees and come here to the United States. Some were quite wealthy and were able to move to other parts of the Middle East or Europe. But the key point to make here again is that many of the refugees lived in temporary housing for generations. Right? Even today, people talk about these refugee camps. They're not tent cities anymore necessarily. But what is the future for someone growing up in a refugee camp? What is their future? What's going to happen to them, their children? Where's their economic mobility? Sometimes when you find people talking about this, especially on the Israeli side, they will condemn the Arab states. They will say, well, you should have done more for these people. They're your fellow Arabs. I think it's important to mention that these Arab states always believed that the refugees would go home, that this was one of the fundamental demands of any peace treaty was the idea that the refugees could go home. So why would you give all of these people citizenship? Why would you build housing for them? Why would you try to, again, integrate them into your society if it's only supposed to be temporary? Whatever the merits of this outlook, this debate, the one thing that is clear is that ordinary Palestinians paid the price for it. Unlike those Jewish refugees that we just mentioned that resettled in Israel, that were incorporated into the Jewish state, that had economic mobility, right? There was some discrimination as well, but on the whole, things were okay. Unlike those Jewish refugees, the Palestinian refugees never got past being displaced people. Now, before his death, Bernadotte had worked enthusiastically to try to help these refugees. Some of his efforts helped lead to the founding of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for the Near East, better known by the acronym UNRWA. But its resources, then as now, were always severely limited. To put this into perspective, in the early 1950s, UNRWA could provide a whopping $27 per year for each refugee. $27 per year. I know back in the 1950s, prices were cheaper, 10-cent hamburgers, all that. $27 is still not going to get you very far for a whole year. Now, we'll discuss in more detail the fate of what happens to these Palestinian refugees in a later episode. But again, the main point that I want to argue here is that while the war in many ways solved the global Jewish question, and we see that not only through the refugees in the 1950s, but Jewish refugees coming in the 80s from Ethiopia, in the 90s from Russia, right? This idea that the world would just close them off and leave them to suffer as they did in the 1920s and 30s. This doesn't happen. They go to Israel, right? The problem is solved. But it does this by creating a Palestinian question, and it is one that will be experienced by regional players in very intense and very kind of horrible and just incredibly sad ways, tragic ways. The other legacy that I want to mention here towards the end of our podcast is that the state of Israel, that was so longed for and so dreamed of by Zionists from such a wide variety of backgrounds, the Israel that came into being in 1948 was born in blood. And what I mean by that is that despite the best efforts of someone like a Chaim Weizmann, an Abdullah, a Faisal, some of the Nashashibis that we talked about earlier, Israel was not created because of a negotiation, especially between Jews and Arabs or Jews and anyone else. Israel was not birthed by some kind of international agreement. There was no commission report or plan that really brought it into being. Yes, there was the UN Partition Resolution 181, but that's not really what made Israel real and tangible and viable. Instead, the questions surrounding Palestine were solved on the battlefield through incredible and intense episodes of violence. Violence, I might add, that was often directed primarily not at other military forces, but at civilians. The memory of this violence has been an enduring legacy of the conflict. It has greatly influenced, some might even say poisoned, the work of reconciliation that would normally follow most conflicts. Doesn't always happen, but usually, eventually, you get some kind of reconciliation work. You get some kind of attempts to understand each other and at least to move past whatever the causes of the violence were. For many Israelis today, their understanding of their relationship with the Palestinians and more broadly other Arabs is framed by the need for security, to prevent any attempt to try to replay the wars of 1947-48 in the hopes of securing a different outcome. The idea that Israel's existence is still existential is one that dominates Israeli politics. And as we've seen, unfortunately, is all too often used to justify the violence that the Israeli state still uses against Palestinians to this day. As we see these horrible things happening in a place like Gaza or even the West Bank, and you say, how can anyone do that? If you ask many Israelis, the answer goes back to the need to survive and fears of violence. Fears that Hamas, for example, has not accepted the right of Israel to exist. That Hamas really wants to tear up everything going back to 1948 and do it all over again, and this time drive the Jews into the sea. It's hard when you have this kind of anxiety or fear or suspicion. It's hard to be generous, to make concessions, and to give the other side a chance. Now, again, that's not all Israelis. Israel's a complicated place, a lot of different politics, a lot of different opinions and perspectives. But I think that's a dominant thread that runs through Israeli politics, this idea of Israel still being in an existential moment. By contrast, for Palestinians, or at least many Palestinians, the legacy of 1948 was different, but it serves a similar purpose. In this understanding, 1948 was the original sin, or perhaps it was the concretization of the original sin of Zionism. This resulted in permanent dispossession and colonial subjugation of the Palestinian people. It is the gaping wound that must be healed either before or perhaps concurrently with any permanent peace plan. Until that point, some would argue, anti-colonial violence like what we saw on October 7th is, in their minds, justified, a reaping of the seeds that were first sown during the Nakba and the First Arab-Israeli War. And again, if you've listened to the podcast at all, you know that I would firmly reject this idea and this framing of things. But as long as you have millions of Palestinians with no future, millions of Palestinians living in refugee camps, millions of Palestinians without a Palestine to invest in and to focus on and to hope for, that wound is still there. And it's hard to have reconciliation when you feel like the primary violation, the primary injustice hasn't been addressed. Now, I don't have any quick or easy solutions to this problem. If anything, we've seen a lot of people that are much more brilliant than I am, much more dedicated than I am. They haven't been able to figure this situation out. But I will say that I think a starting point must be for both societies to revisit and reconsider the events that we've been talking about these past couple episodes. Now, if you talk to individuals, there are some societies as well in both Israel and Palestine, or on the two sides, that have expressed some regret for actions that have been taken and that acknowledge the consequences of the turn to violence. But I have to say, reading some commentaries from both sides, some statements, rhetoric, etc., I just don't get the feeling that, at least en masse, the dominant desire is there to move past 1948. One could say in some ways it feels as if the dominant desire is to keep fighting 1948 over and over and over again. And I just don't see, at a personal level, how that moves us forward. Okay, enough of editorializing. I apologize for that. I know I try not to do that a whole lot, but it's so important, especially with this issue. I know one of the reasons that many of us are captivated by it isn't just that it's going on, but the moral dimensions, the suffering, the kind of endlessness of it, just the moral weight of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is immense. And so I had to throw my 2 cents in there. Let me end by thanking you for listening. If you found this podcast useful, if you found it helpful for understanding things, and you want to support us, the best way that you can do that is simply to recommend us to a friend or to a family member. Now, some of you are on social media. Those posts are really helpful when you say, trying to understand this issue. Check out History Off the Page. It's very, very helpful. If any of you are involved in marketing, you know the number one sort of way that people are persuaded to do something is that their friend or family member recommends it. So if you have a chance to do something like that, drop a line on social media. We would really appreciate that. If you really found this useful and you really, really want to support us, there are a couple ways you can do so financially. You can find links on our website, www.historyoffthepage, for Venmo. We also have Patreon with subscriptions available for just $2 a month. In our next episode, we are going to take a little bit of a break from Israel-Palestine. As you might imagine, this subject is very exhausting. It's difficult. The moral dimensions on both sides are just incredibly weighty, and it's necessary, but I can't say that it's something that really brings me joy to talk about. So I'm going to take a little break on this, and I'm going to pick back up with my main series, which was talking about the history of Europe. The next episode that I'm going to release is going to be on not quite a lighter subject. It's going to be on fascism, on Mussolini and his seizure of power in Italy after 1925. Going forward, I'm going to try to kind of balance the two tracks. I'll try to drop 1 or 2 episodes a month on Israel-Palestine, and then I'll also try to contribute 1 or 2 episodes a month on fascism, because that also is such an important topic that we need to discuss. Anyway, again, thank you everyone for listening. I really appreciate it. That's all for now. We hope you'll join us next time as we take history off the page.